The line chart illustrates the number of inquiries sent to the Tourist Information Office in a particular city via three means of communication, between January and June in 2011. It is clear that visitors to the city made more inquiries in person and via telephone, while written letters and emails became the least common choices. Additionally, the number of inquiries in person experienced the most dramatic change among the different options. In January, the Tourist Information Office received 900 telephone inquiries, while just under 800 letters and emails were received. Not many tourists chose to ask for information in person, with just over 400 queries. Over the next 3 months, the telephone still remained the most popular method of enquiry, at approximately 1,000 queries. Meanwhile, the number of inquiries made in person saw considerable growth to 800, surpassing the figures for emails and postal inquiries. From March to June, inquiries in person were the most common method of inquiry. By June, the number of in-person inquiries soared by more than 1,000 to peak at 1,900. During this period, there was also a significant rise in the figure for telephone inquiries, from 1,000 to 1,600. By contrast, fewer people sent emails or letters to make inquiries, with slightly less than 400 inquiries in May and June. The table provides information about the workforce in silk production, in two countries, England and Wales, over a period of 50 years, starting from 1851. It is clear that the total number of silk workers in the two countries declined over the period, and that significantly more women were employed than men in this industry. Also, the number of silk manufacturing factories increased over the 50-year period, despite some fluctuations. In 1851, the silk workforce was at its peak, with 130,750 employees, including 76,786 females and approximately 54,000 males. In contrast, the number of silk factories was at its lowest in 1851, at only 272. However, 10 years later, the number of silk factories had almost tripled, reaching 761, while the total number of employees experienced a significant fall of over 20,000 people. Over the following 40 years, the total number of female and male workers gradually decreased throughout the period, to 25,567 and 13,375 respectively, which resulted in a drop in the total number of employees, at 38,942 in 1901. Meanwhile, the number of silk factories experienced a gradual decline over these 40 years, from 761 in 1861 to 623 in 1901. The chart illustrates the proportion of people visiting a cinema during 7 days of the week in a European nation from 2003 to 2007. It is clear that there were only small fluctuations in people's preference of which day to go to the cinema over the examined period. People in this country tended to go to the cinema on the weekend rather than on Monday to Friday. In 2003, 40% of people went to cinemas on a Saturday, compared to 30% on Friday or Sunday each. On the other days, the proportion of moviegoers was higher on Tuesday, at 20%, while the lowest figure can be seen on Monday, at only 10%. Over the next 4 years, the percentage of people going to the cinema on weekends increased slightly to 45%, 35% for Saturday and Sunday respectively. Similarly, Thursday and Monday became more popular among cinema goers, with about 2% more people choosing these days. However, fewer people went to see movies on Tuesday and Wednesday, with the figures falling to 19% and 9% respectively. Finally, the proportion of movie-goers choosing to go to the cinema on a Friday remained at 30% during the 3 examined years. The table compares the proportions of people who rode a bike, by age and gender, in 2011. In general, children under 9 years old used bicycles the most, while middle-aged people were the least likely to ride a bicycle. Also, men tended to cycle more than women during the period shown. Among males, children under 9 years old made up the largest proportion of cyclists, at 52%. However, with the older groups, the rates were only 42% for teenagers aged from 10 to 17. And 17% for people aged between 18 and 39. The proportion of 40 to 50-year-old male cyclists was the lowest, at just 12%, while only nearly a fifth of men aged over enjoyed this activity. The percentage of girls younger than 9 years old who cycled was slightly higher than boys of the same age, at 52%. However, the figure for girls aged 10 to 17 was just under a quarter, much lower than that of their counterparts. Similar to men in the same age groups, cycling was not very popular amongst women aged 40 to 59, and 60 or over, accounting for only 8% and 14% of females respectively. The table illustrates how much money an average family in a UK city earned and paid for food and clothes, while the pie charts represent the proportion of spending on those categories in 2010 and 2013. It is clear that while the total income of an average British family decreased between 2010 and 2013, the amount of money spent on food and clothing increased. Additionally, British people spent much more money on food than on clothes in both years. According to the table, in 2010, an average British family earned £29,000, while nearly half of that amount was used for food and clothes. In 2013, the average income of a family in Britain fell to about £25,000. While there was a growth of £1,000 in the expenditure for food and clothes. Regarding the pie charts, the percentage for spending on meat and fish was highest among all categories in 2010, at 29%. But 3 years later experienced a drop to 23%. Similarly, a downward trend was seen in the figure for clothes, from 15% to 13% in 2013. On the other hand, people seemed to spend more money on fruit, vegetables, and dairy products as the figures went up to 30% and 16% respectively. Meanwhile, the proportion of spending on other food remained unchanged at exactly 18%. The pie charts compare the opinions of full-time and part-time students about their university services, including IT support and opening hours. Overall, it is clear that there was more positive feedback with regard to the opening hours than the IT support. Also, full-time students tended to be more satisfied with the two services than their part-time counterparts. Regarding IT support, over half of the surveyed full-time students said that they were very happy with this service, while only a fifth of part-time students reported that they were very happy. In contrast, just 15% of the students studying full-time were not satisfied with IT support, in comparison with 45% of part-time students. The proportion of both types of students being quite happy with this service was relatively the same, at about 1/3. The majority of full-time and part-time students felt very happy with the current opening hours, at 87% and 72% respectively. Only 1% of the examined full-time students were not satisfied with the opening hours, whereas the figure for part-time students was a little higher, at 5%. The remaining 12% of the surveyed full-time students felt quite happy with this service, as opposed to nearly a quarter of part-time students. The chart illustrates the percentage of men, women and children who consumed the recommended amount of fruit and vegetables on a daily basis in 3 different years. Overall, women came out first in terms of fruit and vegetable consumption, while the opposite was true for children. In all 3 years, there was a small difference in the percentage of males and females who consumed enough fruit and vegetables every day. The highest figure for women was 32% in 2006 compared to 28% of men. 2010 witnessed the second highest rank for both women and men's figures. While 27% of women consumed fruit and vegetables, the percentage of men was 24%. And the smallest figure for both women and men, which was nearly the same as the 2010 figures, was recorded in 2002. The smallest percentage of people consuming the daily recommended amount of fruit and vegetables was children, with only 11% in 2002, half as much as that of men and women in the same year. Following that, the figure for children slightly increased to 16% in 2006 before falling marginally to 14% in the last. The bar chart compares 7 countries regarding the yearly payment for doctors and other jobs in the year 2004. It is clear that doctors generally made more money than other types of work in each country during the research period. Also, the average incomes of American doctors and other workers were the highest among the 7 nations. The U.S. doctors earned the largest amount of money compared to those in the other 6 countries, receiving nearly $120,000, while the figures for Switzerland and France were significantly lower, at close to $70,000 each. In contrast, there was only about $50,000 earned by doctors in Finland, as opposed to doctors in the other countries, who received around $61,000 each. Regarding the average salaries of other workers, the amount of money earned by other workers in the U.S. at approximately $45,000 and in Switzerland, at exactly $40,000 was higher than in any of the other nations. Roughly $30,000 was given to French other workers, about $5,000 higher than that of Finnish counterparts. By contrast, the figures for the remaining countries were lowest, at exactly $20,000 each. The table illustrates how much money was given to developing countries by the USA, European countries, and other countries, between 2006 and 2010. Overall, it can be seen that the USA was the biggest contributor to developing nations in all measured years. In addition, European countries and other countries gave similar amounts of money to developing nations each year. In 2006, the USA gave over 3 times as much money to developing nations as European countries did, with a donation of $9.8 million. European and other countries donated $3.1 million and $2.8 million respectively. All countries increased their donations to developing nations over the following 2 years, reaching a total of $24.4 million. In 2009, however, the donations from all countries slightly decreased from the 2008 figures, with a total figure of $23.5 million. However, these figures saw an increase again in 2010, with a total contribution of $28.1 million. Of this, the USA donated $20.3 million, while European and other countries gave $4.10 and $3.7 million respectively. The bar chart shows the percentage of UK residents interested in 6 different sports, in 3 years, 1995, 2000 and 2005. It is clear that walking was by far the most popular physical activity in all surveyed years, while golf was the least popular activity. Additionally, the percentages of people who enjoyed walking, swimming and rugby increased, whereas the figures for those who enjoyed other sports decreased over the measured years. In 1995, walking was the most popular activity, chosen by 40% of the survey participants, while playing snooker and tennis accounted for around 30%. In contrast, about 23% of people chose swimming, while only 18% said they were interested in golf. Meanwhile, approximately 25% of survey respondents chose rugby as their preferred sport. In 2005, slightly more people preferred walking, with the figure rising to just under 45%. But there was a significant decline in the figures for tennis and snooker, to about 22% each. The figures for golf remained the same, at around 15%, as opposed to the figures for swimming and rugby, which experienced considerable gains in popularity to over 25% each. The pie charts illustrates the employment status of people aged 23 to 65, in Ashby and in the UK, in 2008. Overall, the national unemployment rate was lower than the rate in Ashby. Moreover, while British people generally preferred office work, personal service was the most popular profession in Ashby. The percentage of jobless people in Ashby was 14%, whereas that recorded in the whole nation was only 10%. The percentage of Ashby residents who were employed in office work and shop work were 18% and 14% respectively, similar to that of the whole of the UK, at 19% and 13% respectively. In addition, the UK recorded a relatively high proportion of citizens employed in technical work, at 17%. While the figure for the same type of employment in Ashby was only about half that, at 9%. Furthermore, the percentage of construction workers and personal service providers in Ashby, at 16% and 21%, were both higher than the corresponding figures of the UK, at 10% and 17% respectively. Lastly, with regards to professional occupations, 8% of Ashby residents did this type of work, compared to 14% of the whole population. The chart illustrates the average price of monthly plans from 4 cell phone contractors in a European nation in the first 3 quarters of 2002. Overall, there was an increase in the figures for all companies, except for SIM-TX, whose price remained unchanged over the period shown. In addition, the monthly cost of Alpha's contract experienced the most remarkable growth. Alpha originally offered the lowest price in the beginning of 2002 at only €5 per month. The price remained relatively stable during the next 5 months before a surge to €25 in September, which made Alpha the most expensive contractor examined. Meanwhile, Domo's users had to pay the highest price for the majority of 2002 as the price rose gradually from January to July, followed by a slight decrease to about €23 by September. Similarly, there was gradual growth in the price of Lex's contract, from approximately €12 in January to €17 in September. On the other hand, after peaking at €14 in June, the average cost of SIM-TX decreased and returned to its original price of €8. The bar chart and table compare 5 countries in terms of the percentage of families with high-speed Internet access, and the change over 2 consecutive years, from 2001 to 2002. It is clear that the percentage of families with high-speed Internet connection was highest in South Korea and the USA during those years. In addition, the biggest change in the number of families with high-speed Internet access occurred in Britain. In 2001, about 11.2% of South Korean households had access to high-speed Internet, compared to 9.3% of U.S. families. 1 year later, the number of U.S. families with high-speed internet soared by 170% to reach 25.11% of the population, which was the highest figure of all measured countries for those years. By contrast, the growth rate was significantly lower in South Korea, at only 20%. High-speed internet was not as common in Germany, Switzerland and Britain, with only roughly 0.35% of households having a high-speed connection. All three countries saw significant increases over the year, with Germany and Switzerland witnessing increases of 80% and 120% respectively. Meanwhile, Britain saw the biggest growth rate in high-speed internet connections with a 230% increase. The line graph illustrates the percentage of the Japanese population in different age groups from 1960 until now, and projections for the year 2040. Overall, the percentage of people aged 0 to 14 and 15 to 64 follows downward trends over the period shown. The opposite trend, however, can be seen in the percentage of those aged 65 and over. Starting at about 65% in 1960, the proportion of people between 15 and 64 years old hovered during the next 40 years before falling to around 60% in 2018. This figure is predicted to experience a fall to about 52% by 2030, and finally will constitute around 55% of the total population of Japan in 2040. The figures for those aged 0 to 14 follow a somewhat similar pattern, which began at 30% in 1960 and is estimated to drop to about 10% by 2040. In contrast, the percentage of Japanese people aged 65 and above was only 5% in 1960. However, the figures witnessed a significant increase to just under 30% in 2018, and by 2040. It is forecast that approximately 35% of Japan's population will fall into this age group. The table illustrates the percentages of males and females at different physical fitness levels in a particular nation between 1999 and 2009. Obviously, most women and men were at normal weight during the research period. While the percentage of overweight women increased, the reverse was true for men. In 1999, 49% of women had a normal weight, while the figure for those who were underweight stood at about half of that percent. A similar pattern was seen in males, but the figures were smaller, at 41% and 22% respectively. Overweight females made up 18% in that year, much lower than that of female counterparts, with 30%. The percentages of underweight women and men both rose in 2004, to 51% and 48% respectively, before falling to 47% each in 2009. Similarly, overweight females and males accounted for smaller percentages of the population in 2004, at 21% and 23%. And both figures then went down to 19% each in 2009. Despite a rise of 2% in the first 5 years, the percentage of women with an underweight then decreased by 1%. However, the opposite trends were witnessed in underweight men's percentage, with 20% and 23% respectively. The line graph illustrates the percentage of females between 15 to 64 years old having jobs in 5 nations from 2003 to 2009. It is clear that while employment level of women in this age group in Iceland decreased, the percentages of females aged 15 to 64 being employed in the other nations increased. Additionally, the figure for Iceland was largest during the research period. In 2003, just over 80% of females aged 15 to 64 in Iceland had jobs, compared to about 70% of Canadian counterparts. The percentage of employed female Germans was close to 60%, much higher than those of Chile and Turkey, at around 35% and 25% respectively. After 6 years, Iceland saw a slight fall in the employment rate of women in this age group, to under 80%, whereas there were insignificant rises in the figures for Canada and Germany, by about 1% and 5% in turn. A similar climb was seen in Chile, while after a marginal fall in the first 2 years, the rate of employment in Turkey recovered to the initial point in 2009. The table illustrates the percentage of Australians going to the cinema and their frequency from 1994 to 2002, and the line graph presents how many visits were made according to age group. It is clear that the percentage of cinema attendance increased, while the average number of visits decreased over the period shown. Additionally, all age groups witnessed fluctuations in their figures, and 14 to 24-year-olds were the most frequent cinema visitors. In 1994, about 67% of the total population went to cinema, with about 10.7 times a year. This attendance increased to 72% 2 years later and then remained stable until 2002. Despite a fall of 2% from 1998 to 2000. Meanwhile, the average frequency peaked at 11.3 times annually in 1996, but then it stabilized at around 8.3 times. Initially, the youngest group went to the cinema 12 times yearly, followed by 10 times of those aged 25 to 34. In contrast, the figure for the oldest group was lowest, at only 8 times per year. In 1996, the figures for all groups rose by about 1 time before decreasing by nearly 5 times in 1998. After that, the quantity of visits of each group grew slightly, but the most regular visits still belonged to the youngest group, with about 10 times. The pie charts illustrates energy generation from 5 different sources in France in 2 years, 1995 and 2005. It is clear that while the percentages of energy produced from coal, gas, nuclear and other sources increased, the reverse was true for petrol over the period shown. Additionally, coal and gas were the 2 most significant means of energy production in this country during the research period. In 1995, coal was the primary source of energy in France, with the figure registering nearly 30%, while gas and petrol were used to create 29.63% and 29.27% of the total energy respectively. In contrast, only 4.9% of the total energy was manufactured from other sources, compared with 6.4% by nuclear power. In 2005, the proportions of energy generated from coal and gas rose insignificantly to 30.93% and 30.31% respectively. By contrast, much less energy was produced from petrol, as illustrated by a dramatic fall of nearly 10% to only 19.55%. Meanwhile, there were considerable increases in the figures for nuclear and other sources to 10.10% and 9.10% respectively. The pie charts illustrate electricity consumption by various fields in eastern Australia in 2007 and 2010. It is clear that the consumption of electricity from those sectors remained unchanged except for aluminium, manufacturing and other metal fields over the period shown. Additionally, the figures for residential and commercial sectors were by far largest. In 2007, residential areas consumed 28% of total electricity, while 23% of electricity was consumed for commercial purposes. There was 13% of electricity consumed by manufacturing and aluminium sector each, whereas the figures for other metals and mining were slightly lower, at 12% and 9% respectively. By contrast, electricity consumption from transport and agriculture made up only negligible figures. In 2010, while the percentage of electricity consumed by other metals rose significantly by 6%. Those of aluminum and manufacturing fields saw a slight fall to 11% and 9% respectively. Interesting. The proportions of electricity consumed by the other sectors were all as similar as initial figures. The bar chart compares 5 different countries in terms of the number of magazines sold per individual in 2 years 2000 and 2010, with projections for 2020. It is clear that while the number of magazines sold in country D increases, the opposite is true for the other countries. Additionally, the figure for country B is largest, as opposed to the lowest figure which can be seen in country E. In 2000, a resident in country B sold nearly 50 magazines, while just under 50 units and 40 units were sold by an individual in country A and C respectively. In contrast, there were nearly 20 magazines sold by country D, compared to only approximately 6 by country E in 2010. The quantities of magazines sold in country A, B and C fell slightly, whereas the other countries saw the opposite trends in their figures. In 2020, it is predicted that the number of magazines sold in country B, country C and country E decrease minimally by around 1 each, while that of country D rises by similar number. Meanwhile, there was a considerable fall to under 40 in the figure for country A. The diagram illustrates the daily production of oil in 4 countries during the period between 2000 and 2004. Overall, Congo was the leading producer of oil per day during the 5-year period, while Chad produced the least amount of oil per day over the same period. Meanwhile, the amount of oil generated per day each year in Congo decreased over time, while the opposite was true for that of other countries, starting with 205,000 barrels per day in 2000. Nigeria's daily oil production slightly fluctuated around 200,000 to end up at 213,000 barrels per day in 2004. In contrast, Congo's oil production figures were the highest in the first year of the period at 275,000 barrels per day, however, gradually decreased over the years to reach 203,000 barrels per day in 2004. It can also be seen that Somalia produced 5,000 barrels of oil each day in 2000, but later boosted its daily production capability considerably to 10 times more barrels per day in 2004. Finally, oil production in Chad did not begin until 2003, generating 8,000 barrels per day, sharply increasing to 50,000 barrels per day in 2004. The chart illustrates how many passengers used 3 different means of public transport in Somewhere Town, between 2012 and 2015. Overall, the number of passengers using tram saw the biggest growth. Additionally, the figures for train passengers decreased over the period, while the number of bus passengers fluctuated slightly. In 2012, the number of commuters using trains was the highest, at over 75,000 passengers, compared to around 55,000 bus passengers, and approximately 15,000 passengers using trams. However, in 2015, while the number of passengers on buses remained the same, trams had become the most used form of transport, at around 95,000 passengers, with figures for train passengers dropping to around 60,000 people. Additionally, the trends of passengers in 2013 and 2014 were similar, although there was an increase in the total numbers of passengers for each form of transport over the 2 years. Buses were the most popular form of public transport during these years, followed by trains, and finally trams. The table gives information about the actual number of inhabitants in 3 different cities, in 1990 and 2000, as well as the estimated population for 2000. Overall, while the population of São Paulo and Jakarta increased between 1990 and 2000, there was a decline in the population of Shanghai. Meanwhile, São Paulo remained the most populous city during the period shown. In 1990, São Paulo recorded the highest population, at 15 million, followed by Shanghai and Jakarta, with 13.5 million and 9.5 million respectively. Although São Paulo's population was predicted to reach 24 million by 2000, it only rose to 18 million. Similarly, the number of residents in Jakarta increased by 2 million in 2000, to 11.5 million, which was about 2.5 million fewer than forecasted. There were 13.5 million people living in Shanghai in 1990, and the population was expected to experience significant growth over the next decade. However, in reality, it dropped to 12.5 million, instead of the forecasted increase to 17 million. The graph compares 2 cities in England, namely Derby and Nottingham, in terms of the number of houses built each year, from 2000 to 2009. Overall, both sets of figures for Derby and Nottingham witnessed an upward trend over the 10-year period. However, while the number of houses built each year in Derby either increased or stayed the same, the figures for Nottingham saw greater fluctuations. In 2000, the number of newly built homes in Derby was just under 50, and steadily increased over the next 3 years to reach around 125 houses in 2003. The figures then remained the same for the next 4 years before dramatically increasing in 2008 and 2009, to reach a figure of approximately 350 homes by the end of the period. However, the figures for Nottingham followed a rather different pattern. Between 2000 and 2005, the figures for newly built homes fluctuated around 50, before dropping to almost zero in 2006. A large increase of almost 200 newly built houses was seen in 2007. But the figure then once again dropped to around 10 houses in 2008. 2009 witnessed another surge in the number of new houses, with the figure peaking at 250. The line graph compares the amount of emissions released into the air from 3 different sources, between 1990 and 2005. Overall, the total number of air pollutants gradually declined over the period shown, while the figures for industry and households decreased over the period. The figures for transport saw an increase. In 1990, a total of nearly 8 million tons of air contaminants were emitted from the 3 mentioned sources, with the largest figure belonging to industry, at 6 million tons. The amount of pollutants due to transport and households were the same, at approximately 1 million ton each. The total number of pollutants discharged into the air gradually reduced over the next 15 years, with the total figure declining to about 5 million tons by 2005. In addition, air pollutants from industrial activity also decreased over time, from just under 6 million tons in 1990 to about 2 million tons in 2005. Despite the figures for households and transport being equal at the beginning of the period, the quantity of air pollutants from transport saw a small increase to 3 million tons by 2005, while air pollutants from households experienced a drop to a negligible amount. In 5 different age groups, 17 to 26, 27 to 36, 37 to 46, 47 to 54, and 55 to 64, in 1850, 1900, 1950 and 2000. Overall, The percentage of Americans aged 55 to 64 who lived alone were highest in all measured years. In addition, figures for all age groups increased over the period. The percentages of those living alone aged 37 to 46, 47 to 54, and 55 to 64 all followed similar trends over the measured period. There were significant increases in these figures beginning at around 2%, 2% and approximately 3% in 1850, and ending at around 7%, 13% and 17% respectively, in 2000. Additionally, Americans aged 27 to 30,000. Furthermore, Americans aged 17 to 26 also did not start to live by themselves until around 1950, beginning at around 2% and increasing to approximately 5% in 2000. The graph illustrates how much oil was produced and consumed every day in China, over a 24-year period starting from 1982. Overall, China witnessed an increase in both the production and consumption of oil over the period shown. However, oil consumption rose significantly faster than that of its production. At the beginning of the period, the figures for oil production and consumption were both around 2 million barrels per day. However, while the rate of oil consumption rose only slightly over the next 8 years, to approximately 2 million barrels per day, oil production increased significantly per day to 3 million barrels per day in 1986, then remained constant until 1990. From 1990 onwards, the amount of oil that was consumed per day saw steady growth to end up at just over 6 million barrels. Meanwhile, the rate of oil production continued to increase from 1990, but only marginally, ending up at approximately 3.5 million barrels per day in 2006, which was significantly less than the country's consumption rate. The bar chart illustrates oil generation in 6 different nations from 1990 and 2010. It is clear that the amount of oil produced in all countries increased except for Qatar, and that Saudi Arabia saw the biggest change in its capacity. Additionally, while Saudi Arabia was the largest oil manufacturing country over the period shown, in 1990, Saudi Arabia was a leading oil producer as the amount registered over 8 million barrels, while Iran produced about 3 million barrels. In contrast, there were just under 2 million barrels generated in Kuwait, compared to only nearly 1 million barrel in Qatar. Meanwhile, the figures for Iraq and UAE were relatively similar, at around 2 million barrels each. In 2000, the quantity of oil created in UAE remained unchanged, but the other countries experienced slight increases in their figures. In 2010, marginally more oil was produced in Iraq and UAE, as illustrated by rises to around 4 million barrels each, whereas the figure for Kuwait reached well under that amount. In contrast, there was a dramatically growth in the figure for Saudi Arabia to over 14 million barrels, while Qatar's figure still stayed extremely low at under 1 million barrel. The line graph illustrates the number of international conferences held in 3 different cities, over a period of 36 years, beginning in 1965. It is clear that while the number of international conferences held in cities increased dramatically, there were some fluctuations in the figures for the other cities over the period shown. Additionally, City C saw the biggest change in its figures. In 1965, City A held about 35 international meetings, which was the highest figure for all cities in all years. While just under 30 conferences were organized in City B. In contrast, there were no international conferences in City C in that year. Over the next 35 years, The number of international meetings that took place in city rose sharply to peak at over 30 in 1980, and then fell slightly before rising again to around 30 in 2010. The figures for the other cities, however, both witnessed some fluctuations throughout the period, both holding approximately 25 conferences each in the final year. The bar chart illustrates the proportion of global population in 4 nations in 2 years 1950 and 2002, and also predictions for 2050. It is clear that while the percentages of population in India increases, the reverse is true for the other countries over the period shown. Additionally, China and India have highest proportions of population, whereas the figure for Japan is by far lowest during the research period. In 1950, China was the most populous nation with the figure registering around 23%, while the Indian population accounted for 15% of world population. In contrast, about 7% of people in the world were from the USA, compared to only less than 5% from Japan. In 2002, the rate of the Indian population rose slowly, while China, the US and Japan all saw declines in their figures. In 2050, India is predicted to have the largest population as illustrated by an increase to nearly 20%. By contrast, the proportions of population in China and Japan are projected to decrease to 15% and about 2% respectively. Meanwhile, the figure for the USA is likely to remain the same, at 5%. The bar chart compares the percentage of car trips made by male and female drivers for 8 different purposes in 2005. It can be seen that commuting to work was the most common reason for car travel for both males and females. Meanwhile, visiting town, recreation, going to the bank, running errands, and visiting friends were the reasons for car travel that saw the biggest difference between the percentages of men and women doing these activities. In 2005, 52% of men traveled to work by car, which was about 13% higher than that of women for the same purpose. By contrast, slightly more women than men went on car trips for shopping, with 16% and 10%, respectively. Similarly, the percentages of men and women driving to courses were fairly similar, at 8% and 12% respectively. The percentage of each gender was considerably different with regards to other purposes. The percentage of men who made car trips to visit town, at 9%, and for recreation, at 11%, were nearly 3 times more than that of women for each purpose. While cars were used by around 8% to 10% of women for going to the bank, running errands, and visiting friends, approximately 4% of men used a car for the same purpose. The given pie charts illustrate the percentage breakdown of goods exported from 3 South American countries. In 2010, it is clear that while Argentina and Chile's exports were distributed more evenly amongst other nations, the large majority of Mexico's exports were to the USA. From the charts it can be seen that Argentina and Chile's export trends were almost identical, with the majority of their exports going to other Latin American countries, at 38% for Argentina and 31% for Chile. Meanwhile, 26% of Argentina's exports went to Europe, 16% to the USA, and 20% to other countries. Similarly, Chile's exports consisted of 30% to Europe, 18% to the USA, and 21% to other countries. In contrast, the large majority of Mexico's exports were to the USA, at 82%. The remaining exports from Mexico were to Europe, at 6%, other Latin American countries, at 6%, and other countries, also receiving 6%. The bar charts display the results from a 2009 survey regarding people's automobile purchasing habits in a European country. Overall, it can be seen that the majority of consumers tended to purchase a new car after 5 years or more of using their old vehicle. Meanwhile, second-hand cars were the most popular choice with regards to the type of vehicle purchased. The first bar chart shows that approximately 52% of people in this particular country changed cars after 5 or more years, and roughly 37% changed cars after 3 to 4 years. About 5% of people changed cars every 2 years, 1% of people changed every year, and approximately 3% of people never changed. Furthermore, about 2% of people didn't even own a car. With regards to the type of vehicle purchased, approximately 68% of people chose to buy second-hand cars, while about 25% bought brand new vehicles. In addition, roughly 10% of people sometimes purchased either new or second-hand cars. The charts compare different types of citrus fruit exports from a number of different countries in 2010. Overall, oranges were by far the fruit that was exported the most, in terms of weight, followed by lemons and then grapefruits. Orange exports were the highest, with South Africa exporting just over 1 million metric tons. Egypt and the U.S. also exported a large amount of oranges, at 900,000 and 700,000 metric tons respectively. With regards to lemon exports, Turkey was the main exporter, with 500,000 metric tons, followed by Mexico and Argentina, at approximately 440,000 and 260,000 metric tons. Grapefruits were the third most commonly exported fruit, with the U.S. and South Africa both exporting around 230,000 tons, while Turkey managed to export around 50,000 tons less than those countries. In terms of other types of citrus fruits, Mexico was responsible for 450,000 metric tons of exports. The U.S. and Israel made minimal contributions in comparison. The tables compare data regarding the temperatures and daylight hours in Mumbai and Moscow during the same week in May 2017. Overall, it can be seen that Mumbai was significantly hotter than Moscow. However, Moscow experienced much longer daylight hours. Regarding the temperatures of the two cities, Mumbai had consistently high temperatures, ranging between 33 to 34 degrees Celsius at its peak, and only dropping to 29 degrees Celsius at its low each day. In contrast, the temperature in Moscow was considerably lower, with the maximum varying between 8 to 13 degrees Celsius, and the minimum ranging from 2 to 9 degrees Celsius. Additionally, while Saturday was the hottest day in Mumbai, Sunday was the hottest day in Moscow. As for the hours of daylight, the sun rose in Mumbai every day at 6 a.m., and set between 7:05 p.m. and 7:15 p.m. However, Moscow received a lot more daylight hours, with the sun rising between 4:05 a.m. and 4:15 a.m. each day, and setting at 10 p.m. each of the recorded days. Additionally, Saturday had the longest amount of daylight hours in both cities. The line graph compares and predicts the proportion of the population, in 3 different age groups, in a particular country, from 1960 to 2040. Overall, people aged 15 to 64 accounted for the greatest percentage of the population for all recorded and predicted years. It is also clear that while the proportion of people aged 65 and over increased during the period, the percentage of those aged less than 65 decreased, with both trends expected to continue into the future. In 1960, just over half of the population was aged 15 to 64. The figure then slightly fluctuated over the next 50 years, peaking at about 60% in 1970 and 1990. It is forecasted to gradually decline to around 45% by 2040. Meanwhile, the percentage of people aged 0 to 14 began at 30% in 1960 and dropped to half of that by 2000. This figure is also predicted to continue decreasing to reach around 10% by 2040. From the graph, it can also be seen that the percentage of elderly people in this country experienced remarkable growth during the period. In 1960, only 15% of the population was aged 65 or older. The figure began to rise in 1970 to be at 20% in 2000. This figure has continued to rise, and is expected to continue rising in the future. The pie charts compare 5 different areas in terms of the proportions of world forest and timber in each region. It is clear that while forests in Africa make up the largest percentage of total global forest, the opposite is true for Europe. Additionally, North America is the country with the largest amount of timber, while the figure for Africa is by far lowest. In terms of forest, just over half of all forest in the world is found in Africa and North America, at 27% and 25% respectively. In contrast, only 16% of global forest is found in South America, and 14% in Europe. Asian countries accounts for 18% of total forest in the world. Regarding the proportions of timber in these areas, North America contains the largest percentage, at 30%. While 23% and 20% of global timber can be found in South America and Europe respectively. Meanwhile, timber in Asia comprises 18% of world timber, which is exactly double that of Africa. The given line graph compares the percentage of people in Africa who subscribed to mobile and fixed-line phones, from 1994 to 2004. Overall, the line graph shows that the percentage of subscribers for both mobile and fixed-line phones increased over the period. However, while fixed-line phones were the most popular choice at the beginning of the period, mobile phones were significantly more popular by the end of the period. In 1994, 1.7% of African inhabitants subscribed to fixed-line phones, with only 0.06% of people using mobile phones. Both types of phone subscriptions slowly increased over the following 4 years, with mobile phones increasingly gaining popularity and equaling the percentage of fixed-line users in the year 2000, at approximately 2.5%. From 2000 onwards, while the percentage of fixed-line subscribers continued to slowly increase, the percentage of mobile phone users saw a dramatic rise, ending up at 8.8% in 2004. Compared to 3.1% for fixed-line subscribers in the same year. The bar chart compares the recycling rates of 4 different kinds of waste material: plastic, cans, paper, and glass, in a city, from 1992 to 2002. It is clear that the percentage of all types of recycled waste generally increased over the period. While glass was the most recycled waste material, the opposite was true for plastic during the majority of the period. Paper and glass were the 2 most recycled types of waste material during most of the period. Beginning at approximately 14% and 15% respectively, both figures rose considerably to 21% and 29% 5 years later. By the end of the period, the recycling rates of paper and glass were almost double that of plastic and cans, at approximately 40% and 50%. Plastic and cans were recycled far less, with the figures beginning at around 10% and 18% respectively, in 1992. While the figure for plastic slightly increased by about 2% in 1997, the figure for cans dropped by about half. In 2002, the figure for recycled plastic remained the same, however, the amount of cans recycled jumped back up to around 20%. The two line graphs illustrate the percentage of trains, from a particular company, that were either cancelled or running late in October and November in 2008. It is clear that the percentage of trains that were delayed or cancelled both witnessed significant fluctuations over the period shown. Additionally, while the highest percentage of train trips were cancelled in October, the highest percentage of trains that were late occurred in November. In the first week of October, about 20% of all trains did not run on time. This figure then rose slightly in the next week before dropping to about 5% in the last week of October. In contrast, approximately half of all trains were late during the second week in November, followed by a slight drop to 40% in the third week. Starting at only 1% of total trains in the first week. The percentage of trains that were cancelled reached a peak of 7% in the second week, but later dropped back to the initial figure. There was an increasing fluctuation in this figure throughout the rest of the period, with about 4% of total trains being cancelled in the final week. The bar chart illustrates changes in the number of cars per household in a particular European nation from 1971 to 2001. It is clear that car ownership in this country rose over the period shown. While the percentage of families with one and two or more cars increased, the figure for households without a car decreased. In 1971, nearly half of the residents in this country did not possess a car, while about 30% of families owned one car, and around 18% of families owned two or more cars. 10 years later, the figures for those with no car or one car dropped to just over 40% and 30% respectively. Meanwhile, families with two or more cars increased to just under 30%. 1991 saw a dramatic rise in one-car ownership, peaking at almost 50%, while the percentage of families with no car, or two or more cars, both decreased. In 2001, the percentage of families with no car, or two or more cars, was about equal, at just under 30%, while about 44% of households owned one car. The line graph illustrates the price of 800 grams of various types of bread in a particular European nation over 5 consecutive years, starting from 2001. It is clear that while the price of brown, white and rye bread increased, the price of whole grain bread witnessed a wild fluctuation over the period shown. Additionally, the figure for brown bread saw the biggest change. In 2001, residents in this country had to spend €0.8 for 800 grams of whole grain bread, while the other types only cost €0.6 each. In 2002, the price of whole grain, brown and white bread increased dramatically, with the figure for whole grain bread reaching a peak of €1.8, whereas the price of rye bread saw a slight decline. From 2002 to 2005, the figures for rye bread and white bread both increased considerably to €1.3 and €0.7 respectively, while there was a substantial drop of €1 in the price of whole grain bread in 2005. Meanwhile, the price of brown bread fluctuated wildly between €1.4 and €1.6 throughout the period. The line chart illustrates the number of inquiries sent to the Tourist Information Office in a particular city via 3 means of communication, between January and June in 2011. It is clear that visitors to the city made more inquiries in person and via telephone. while written letters and emails became the least common choices.